So, hi everyone. I did introduce myself at the beginning, but I'm a researcher from the Nelson Mandela University, mostly looking at sort of estuarine ecology, water quality, and with a particular interest in half-algal blooms, so like phytoplankton, but basically any sort of water quality issue. So I'll just do a bit of a quick report back on some of the monitoring observations in the hypereutrophic Hartenbos Estuary and sort of some of the implications for management. This is work that obviously I've done with a lot of colleagues from CSIR, from Nelson Mandela University itself, and then also quite important to all of this was Warren Manuel and his team from the Mossel Bay municipality. So just a quick background. Eutrophication, I won't read that, you can read at the bottom there for the sort of official definition, but basically it's enrichment of water from anthropogenic sources that produces a response in the primary producer community, so that's plants, and then that produces an undesirable disturbance to the balance of organisms in an ecosystem. So the undesirable disturbances part is the key part to what eutrophication is, and some of these include harmful algal blooms, which can be toxic, obviously oxygen depletion, loss of submerged macrophytes, fish kills, and in severe cases, formation of dead zones. Some of the research objectives and questions from this study, which is actually still ongoing, which I'll touch on now, was to assess the biotic community dynamics in the hypereutrophic Hartenbos Estuary, and to assess whether or not there are any harmful algal bloom species present, and how do the different biotic communities respond to breaching events, and which I'm sure quite a few of you know in the Hartenbos is quite a frequent event. And also ultimately then to provide recommendations for management that will serve to improve the health and hope for some sort of natural functionality of the estuary. So just to give you a bit of a background, the main issue in the Hartenbos Estuary is that part that is circled in red, and that is the regional wastewater treatment works. I think it works out to pumping out about 8 megaliters per day, which equates to about almost 40 kilograms of dissolved inorganic nitrogen and about 20 kilograms of phosphorus every day into a system that is very small compared to some of the larger systems, and also is naturally a closed system that would only open intermittently. So just on the top, you don't need to sort of take too much of it in, but you'll see if you compare the Kleinbruck and the Great Bruck, Kleinbruck is sort of relatively in the good, I say relatively, compared to the others, it's in relatively good condition. Great Bruck, you'll see there's a bit of red there, and which is expected because it has its own issues. But the Hartenbos, basically, it's almost any parameter that you measure, it comes out as sort of indicating eutrophic conditions. So what we did was with colleagues from, like I said, from CSIR and Nelson Mandela University, we undertook a seasonal sampling campaign where we actually went to the estuary. I think it was 5 times in total from the beginning of February 2019 until January 2020. And then also from that February 2019 up until basically the last sample I got was last week, Friday. We're still doing bi-weekly sampling in the estuary, and that happens at, if you look at the map there, the bi-weekly sampling happens at Site 1 at the mouth, and then at the Opot Bridge at Site 4. And some of the stuff that we look at, or we looked at, are the physicochemistry, so salinity, temperature, all of that stuff, nutrients, mainly nitrogen and phosphorus, and then some of the biotic components. The biotic components, the phytoplankton happens for both the seasonal and the bi-weekly sampling, and then the mycophytobenthus, benthic invertebrates, and fish were done on the seasonal sampling trips. And then obviously this is all complemented by flow and water level data to try to help explain what is happening. So yeah, you can see some pictures that I talked the other day, and it's not good for the estuary, but when the estuary is in such poor condition, it makes for quite nice pictures and presentations. That's about the only good thing that comes out of it. The first thing to look at is, as I mentioned, the system is breached frequently. And this tends to happen, the mouth management plan, I think, says once it reaches 1.9 meters within the estuary, that is sort of the level at which breaching should occur. If you look at, I don't know if you can see my arrow on the screen, but we've had, when we did, this is the seasonal sampling, and this is actually a paper that we've now published. Initially, they were trying to breach at about 2 meters, but I think with certain pressures, I think there's residents that obviously are worried about flooding, And then also, as you'll notice, when you get closer to your December holiday times, that level gets a bit lower as well, because they're then opening for, if you want to call it, maybe not the wrong reasons, but they're not doing it necessarily just for the flooding purposes. They want the mouth open during those times. So just to sort of give you some context, since the beginning of the study till today, I think roughly there's been about 13 to 14 official mouth breaching events, interspersed with a few illegal breaching events. And this sort of equates to bi-monthly breaching, which is extremely frequent for a system of this size compared to its natural. And if you look at, however, even though it's breached so often, the marine connectivity within the system only occurs for about 10% of the time. And marine connectivity meaning tidal exchange, where you can see the water goes up and down, yeah, and that shows you when the tide's coming in and out. The other thing that you'll note here is this blue one over here was followed by a relatively long period of about a week or two of tidal action. These other levels, or these other breaching events in the green, they're breached, but because they were breached at lower levels, you don't actually get any tidal intrusion, and the mouth basically immediately starts closing again. So you're not actually facilitating any exchange or any connectivity. So just based on this, it seems that if you want to improve your flushing, your best bet is to at least go at about 2 meters, and obviously to do this on spring tides. So I'll play the video in the background, but this is the bi-weekly data. And what you can take from this is every time the salinity's got a bit of a spike, that tends to be when they've done breaching events. And when the mouth is closed, it obviously freshens, and then they breach and it goes up a little bit, but you see not too much. And the other key thing to take from this is, if you look at the salinity range, we're sort of talking about between 5 and 25. So the system is largely meso polyhaline, where naturally it would have been more marine under, I think there were studies done in the 1980s and 1990s that showed that the system would generally be in your marine, sometimes even hypersaline conditions. So we've lost that state completely. And that's because of that continuous inflow of wastewater discharges. The other thing to note here is the oxygen extremes. Typically, your normal oxygen would somewhere fall between this 5 and 10 range, but you can see, because of, which I'll show on the next slide, there's extreme phytoplankton blooms in the system. That oxygen level goes up to over 20 milligrams sometimes, and then when that happens, sometimes there's an overcapacity, that bloom collapses, and then you get this big drop-off in oxygen, which can result in scenes like this, which have happened at least twice during the monitoring period so far. Then looking at the phytoplankton, I know there's a lot going on, but basically this yellow line, and I've had to log the scale here, so it goes up in powers of 10, because the phytoplankton biomass is so high all the time. 20 micrograms per liter is considered a bloom in a normal estuary. A hypereutrophic estuary is considered at about 60 micrograms per liter. The Hartenbos Estuary has a mean phytoplankton biomass of over 200, and that has been interspersed with a few events of over 1,000 and even one that hit over 2,000. So it's extremely high, and these facilitate those drastic shifts in dissolved oxygen that we saw. And then, as I said, you end up with stuff like this, and I'm sure a lot of you who are working in the area or have seen the area, this bright green water is quite common. What this all means in terms of the phytoplankton community that we've seen, the most common species, almost regardless of what the salinity is, the only time the species sort of goes away is when the salinity gets up into like the 30s. But it's a tiny little green, well, it's actually a eustigmatophyce, which is called Nanochloropsis, and it's extremely dense. Luckily, it is not directly toxic or anything to any fauna, but the concerns come obviously from getting such a high biomass and the fact that it then smothers out the bottom water and creates hypoxic conditions. And there's a big variety of other bloom species that we've encountered depending on what the salinity is. And another key take home here is the breaching doesn't, the Zandvlei estuary, for instance, in Cape Town, when they breach, they've sort of been able to breach and facilitate increased salinity intrusion all the way up the estuary, and that's shown a decrease in phytoplankton bloom events. what happens in the Hartenbos is you don't get a decrease in bloom events, you simply get a switch in the species. Sometimes that one that was over 2,000 was the species here called Heterosigma akashiwo, which produces a mucilage and can have severe effects on the hypereutrophic levels. Some of the other biotic responses that came from this paper that was published this year with Laura and Steve and some other colleagues, we looked at the benthic microalgae, we looked at the invertebrates, and we looked at the fish. And basically, the key take-home stories here were that there's extremely low species diversity, regardless what community you're looking at. And then these communities tend to be dominated by a few, one or two very stress-tolerant species. And this has also resulted in a loss of key species, and this is predominantly comparing with before all this wastewater treatment works and all the artificial breaching back in the 80s and 90s. There's been a loss of the sand prawn from the benthic community, which has then related in a loss of certain fish species. One of the most key losses has been the loss of the estuarine resident species, which is the Cape silverside. It used to be dominant in the estuary before, and it's an important fodder species for higher trophic levels or bigger consumers. And that species was not recorded once throughout the entire period. So these phytoplankton blooms, and the reason for that is that species likes clearer water columns and submerged macrophyte beds, and the big blooms that happen in the system all the time basically have caused extreme turbidity, low oxygen levels, and obviously a loss of submerged macrophytes. There used to be zostra in the system, and now there is almost nothing left. And all of this is basically related to the nutrients coming in, which cause the blooms, and ultimately this is also made worse by the fact that there's very little tidal exchange. So some of the key observations is the mouth management interventions that currently occur sort of helped with a small degree of hydrodynamic variability, but as you saw from that one of the first slides, was that quite often those breaching events don't actually cause any tidal exchange. It simply empties the estuary, it closes again, and then it all just starts basically happening again. So we're stuck in a bit of a catch-22. That one thing that it does do, obviously, and I suppose important for the locals, is it does achieve desired water levels. However, the underlying issues are unresolved. So mouth management is kind of putting a plaster on a wound. The main issue and the reason that we need to breach mouths and the reason that we have fish kills and the reason that we have all these bad things happening in the system is that there is this constant inflow of wastewater treatment discharges into a very small system. And that's not to say that the wastewater treatment works, even though they have occasions when things go bad. It's not to say that they aren't going according to the guidelines set out by the Department of Water and Sanitation. However, based on the size and the proximity of these inputs, it's just unsustainable and why we are where we are now in the system. And this has all resulted in a diversity of harmful algal blooms, a loss of key species, and also a loss of the marine dominated state, which is quite key. And the ecosystem has now shifted into an undesirable stable state. And you can see from this little diagram, once the pressure gets too much, a system gets to a tipping point, and then once it falls down into this new state, it's very difficult to bring it back up here. If in some cases, it's never impossible to improve, but it will take quite a long time for the system to recover. So some of the things that can be done in the system is the diversion of these wastewater treatment work discharges, and this can be done through diverting it through artificial wetlands. You can also reclaim some of these effluents for industrial and irrigation use. I think in the case of the Hartenbos, there is an allocation, I'm guessing now, of I think it's about 1 megaliter that goes to for livestock watering. So it is being done. It could possibly be done more. On the short term is to optimize the mouth breaching protocol, and that would facilitate more effective flushing of the middle and upper reaches, and this probably would only happen when the mouth is above 2 meters, or the water level, sorry, above 2 meters. And ultimately this would also help to prevent sedimentation, because, which I'll touch on at the end of this, one thing that's happened in the Great Bruck, for instance, when you open the mouth and there isn't that pressure build-up behind the berm, and you don't have fresh water, like a pulse coming down, all that happens is you actually end up putting more sediment into the system, and the lower reaches start to shallow, which then makes breaching and connectivity more of an issue going forward. And obviously, it helps to keep continuously monitoring the system, because this will help with early warnings of harmful algal blooms that can result in potential fish kills. Thank you. I will quickly touch on the Great Bruck estuary that we